Hello, cooking enthusiasts. This week's video is going to be about dry-aged beef and one dish I recently made using it. I have made a few videos and posted a lot on social media about dry aging beef and other experiments. Quite a while ago, I was using a modified mini fridge, but I recently switched back to using the Umai dry aging bags. The separate mini fridge we were using eventually got too damaged from the high moisture content we had to maintain. Since switching back to the dry aging bags, we haven't had any issues, however, so they do definitely get the job done. There is a similar product called dry aging wraps that I would love to try, but they aren't available outside of the United States, from what I can tell. This current piece we were working on was a section of beef brisket. This was at least part of the brisket flat, so some parts were a little lean. It's also grass-fed beef from a nearby island. So in my experience from this source, the pieces are a little on the small side. I don't know if that is a consequence of just being grass-fed beef on an island on a small scale, or if they slaughter their animals on the slightly younger side. We ended up dry aging this section of brisket for 55 days, and we have previously dry aged a similar piece from the same source, but for a little less time. The previous brisket we dry aged is probably going to end up entirely in burgers and similar projects. It's already been processed and broken down into a few smaller segments. Originally, we were maybe going to smoke this entire dry-aged brisket, but I don't think extreme dry aging really lends itself to that style of cooking. So instead, we are cleaning this piece up and breaking it into a few pieces. We will freeze some of it for later, but we will probably make more dishes that use it, not as ground meat. The really dry pieces of exterior pellicle are being saved for an eventual koji-based amino sauce, and pieces of fat were isolated and then separately rendered. Many of the dishes we had in mind for the brisket involved slicing it very thin, but since we had some uneven end pieces, I thought we should try tartar. Since we were working with brisket, I decided to be inspired by Montreal smoked meat, which is a product very similar to pastrami. I wanted to keep the tartare very simple with some quick pickled onions. So this was just a little bit of white onion turned into a fairly fine dice. We hit it with a little bit of near boiling water, and this is going to very partially cook it and remove some of the raw intensity. After just a few seconds, that hot water just gets drained. After the hot water, a little bit of salt and just a nice clean vinegar was added. This was actually a homemade honey vinegar, but obviously you could use white wine vinegar or apple cider vinegar, anything that isn't too distinct. And those just sit at room temperature until we are ready to use them. The next component to talk about is the egg yolk. A classic tartar uses raw egg yolk, but I wanted to actually smoke the egg yolk since it was inspired by Montreal smoked meat. As you will see, we came up with a very simple miniature smoking setup, and we didn't give it quite enough smoke. It was probably under there for about 20 minutes. In addition to the egg yolks, we also attempted to smoke a little spice mixture that was going to season the tartar. We really just eyeballed the spice mixture, but it involved black pepper, mustard seed, coriander, a little bit of dill seed, and a little bit of oregano. And once again, it did need a little more smoke, but that is something to improve next time. And after the very brief smoking, I decided to put the eggs into the ANOVA. I am totally comfortable with raw eggs, but I thought I would take advantage of the equipment. The ANOVA is set to 61 degrees Celsius and 100% steam. This will just barely cook the egg yolks, which will make them a little easier to handle and will also make them slightly warm for service. While again, I have used raw egg yolks in the past, this warmed up egg yolk is also pretty nice. The next step was chopping up the beef. Again, brisket isn't normally used for tartar, but this actually turned out pretty good. I'm going to have to edit and accelerate this footage quite a bit. My dad decided to do a pretty meticulous dice on this beef, and then it was followed by a few more rough chops throughout to really break down the size of the beef pieces. The level that you break this down is really up to personal preference. For something that is relatively tender, you can definitely go a little bit chunkier, but I think this relatively fine hand chop worked well for brisket. After that, it's pretty much just time for assembly. The beef is getting dressed with a little bit of good olive oil, followed by some of the lightly pickled onions. The spice mixture is getting lightly crushed and added to the beef. In the future, I probably would have crushed it a little bit finer and also used a little more. Similar to the egg yolks, it also didn't quite get enough smoke on it. After the basic dressing, the beef mixture goes in the fridge temporarily, and we are serving the tartar with some sourdough toast. This was actually the shoyu sourdough I made 2 videos ago, so you can actually find that recipe. Very thinly sliced, and then we are actually frying the bread in some rendered dry aged beef fat from this same brisket. Once the bread is nicely fried, it gets set aside, and it's time for the final assembly. As is pretty classic, we are using a ring mold to plate the tartar. We probably used one that was a little bit big, but I ended up not minding the sort of large, shallow presentation. Also, of course, making a little divot for the egg yolk. So the beef mixture is chilled. The egg yolk is just very lightly cooked and slightly warm. We use a little more spice mixture on top of the tartar and egg yolk. This one especially could have been a little finer. And then we just finish with salt. That is really it for this dish. As I've mentioned, there's a few improvements I would make, especially with implementing the smoke flavor, but overall, it was a simple and delicious tartar. I think the lean brisket worked surprisingly well, and the dry aging probably did help tenderize it somewhat. If you have any questions about some of the techniques or ingredients I used, please let me know in the comments. Please consider sharing and subscribing and all that good stuff. But otherwise, thank you for watching.